Welcome to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on Instagram @snoozecast to find behind-the-scenes content. If you enjoy our show, please write a review on the podcast app. Also, share us with a friend. This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters, including our newest patron, Stephanie. Thanks so much, Stephanie. And also by Mystic Virtue. Tonight, we'll read Herbs for Incantations, an excerpt from The Folklore of Plants by T.F. Thistleton Dyer, published in 1889. The Reverend Thistleton Dyer was a British curate and vicar, along with a writer of popular non-fiction books such as this one and The Strange Pages from Family Papers, which was considered a masterpiece of popular historical writing. He was particularly admired for his ability to couple in-depth research with the suspense and excitement normally associated with the nascent art of detective fiction. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. Plants for Incantations. The vast proportions in bygone years explains the magic properties which we find ascribed to so many plants in most countries. In the nefarious trade carried on by the representatives, certain plants were largely employed for working marvels. Hence, the mystic character which they have ever since retained. It was necessary, however, that these should be plucked at certain phases of the moon, or seasons of the year, or from some spot where the sun was supposed not to have shone on it. Hence, Shakespeare makes one of his witches speak of root of hemlock digged in the dark, and of slips of yew slivered in the moon's eclipse, a practice which was long kept up. The plants, too, which formed the witch's pharmacopoeia, were generally selected either from their legendary associations or by reasons of their poisonous and soporific qualities. Thus, two of those most frequently used as ingredients in the mystic cauldron were the vervain and the rue, these plants having been specially credited with supernatural virtues. The former probably derived its notoriety from the fact of its being sacred to Thor, an honor which marked it out, like other lightning plants, as peculiarly adapted for occult uses. It was, moreover, among the sacred plants of the Druids, and was gathered by them when the dog star arose from unsunned spots. At the same time, it is noteworthy that many of the plants which were in repute with witches for working their marvels were reckoned as countercharms, a fact which is not surprising, as materials used by wizards and others for magical purposes have generally been regarded as equally efficacious if employed against their charms and spells. Rue, likewise, which entered so largely into magic rites, was once much in request as an antidote against such practices, and nowadays, when worn on the person in conjunction with maidenhair, broom straw, and ground ivy, it is said to confer fine vision and to point out the presence of witches. It is still an undecided question as to why rue should, out of all other plants, have gained its widespread reputation with witches. At any rate, it seems to have acquired at an early period in this country a superstitious reverence for. We find the missionaries sprinkling holy water from brushes made of it, whence it was called herb of grace. Respecting the rendezvous of witches, it may be noted that they very frequently resorted to hills and mountains, their meetings taking place on the meadow, under the oak, at the pear tree. Thus the fairy rings, which are often to be met with on the Sussex Downs, are known as hag tracks, from the belief that they are caused by hags and witches who dance there at midnight. Their love for sequestered and romantic localities is widely illustrated in Europe, as the fame of particular witch mountains extends over wide kingdoms. According to a tradition current in northern Netherlands, no woman is to be found at home on a Friday, because on that day they hold their meetings and have dances on a barren heath. Occasionally, too, they show a strong predilection for certain trees, to approach which as nighttime draws near is considered highly dangerous. The Judas tree was one of their favorite retreats, perhaps on account of its traditional association with the apostle. The Neapolitan Italian witches held their tryst under a walnut tree near Benevento, and at Bologna the peasantry tell how these evil workers hold a midnight meeting beneath the walnut trees on St. John's Eve. The elder tree is another haunt under whose branches witches are fond of lurking, and on this account caution must be taken not to tamper with it after dark. Also, they have their favorite flowers, one having been the foxglove, nicknamed witches' bells, from their decorating their fingers with its blossoms, while in some localities the harebell is designated the witch's thimble. On the other hand, flowers of a yellow or greenish hue were distasteful to them. In the witchcraft movement, it would seem that certain plants were in requisition for particular purposes, these workers of darkness having utilized the properties of herbs to special ends. A plant was not indiscriminately selected, but on account of possessing some virtue as to render it suitable for any design that the witches might have in view. Considering, too, how multitudinous and varied were their actions, They had constant need of applying to the vegetable world for materials with which to carry out their plans. But foremost amongst their requirements was the power of locomotion, wherewith to enable them their supernatural rapidity to travel from one locality to another. Accordingly, one of their most favorite vehicles was a broom, an implement which, it has been suggested, from its being a type of the winds, is an appropriate utensil in the hands of the witches who are wind makers and workers in that element. According to the Asiatic Register for 1801, the Eastern as well as the European witches practiced their spells by dancing at midnight, and the principal instrument they use on such occasions is a broom. Hence, in Hamburg, sailors, after long toiling against a contrary wind, on meeting another ship sailing in the opposite direction, throw an old broom before the vessel, believing thereby to reverse the wind. As, too, in the case of vervain and rue, the broom, although dearly loved by witches, is still extensively used as a counter-charm against their machinations, it being a well-known belief, both in England and Germany, that no individual of this stamp can step over a broom laid inside the threshold. In Bohemia, for instance, the young men collect for some weeks beforehand as many worn-out brooms as they can lay their hands on. These, after dipping in tar, they light, running with them from one bonfire to another, and when burnt out, they are placed in the fields as charms against blight. The large ragwort, known in Ireland as the fairy's horse, has long been sought for by witches when taking their midnight journeys. The same legendary belief prevails in Cornwall in connection with the Castle Peak, a high rock to the south of the Logan Stone. Here, many a man and woman too, now quietly sleeping in the churchyard of St. Leven, would, had they the power, attest to have seen the witches flying into the castle peak on moonlit nights, mounted on the stems of the ragwort. Amongst other plants used for a similar purpose were the bulrush and reed, in connection with which may be quoted the Irish tale of the rushes and cornstalks that turn into horses the moment you bestride them. In Germany, witches were said to use hay for transporting themselves through the air when engaged in their various occupations. They often considered it expedient to escape detection by assuming invisibility, and for this object sought the assistance of certain plants, such as the fern seed. In Sweden, hazelnuts were supposed to have the power of making invisible. and it may be remembered how in one of Andersen's stories, the elfin princess has the faculty of vanishing at will by putting a wand in her mouth. But these were not the only plants supposed to confer invisibility, for German folklore tells us how the far-famed luck flower was endowed with the same wonderful property, and by the ancients the heliotrope was credited with a similar virtue. Heliotrope is a stone of such extraordinary virtue that the bearer of it's effectually concealed from the sight of all present, in the way the agate is similarly said to render a person invisible and to turn the swords of foes against themselves. The Swiss peasants affirm that the Ascension Day wreaths of the amaranth make the wearer invisible, and in the Tyrol the mistletoe is credited with this property. But some plants, as we have already pointed out, were credited with the magic property of revealing the presence of witches and of exposing them engaged in the pursuit of plying their nefarious calling. In this respect, the St. John's wort was in great request, and hence it was extensively worn as an amulet, especially in Germany on St. John's Eve, a time when not only witches, by common report, peopled the air, but evil spirits wandered about on no friendly errand. Thus the Italian name of devil chaser, from the circumstance of its scaring away the workers of darkness by bringing their hidden deeds to light. This, moreover, accounts for the custom, so prevalent in most European countries, of decorating doorways and windows with its blossoms on St. John's Eve. In England, its having been placed over the doors, together with green birch, fennel, or pine, and white lilies, whereas in France the peasantry still reverence it as dispersing every kind of unseen evil influence. The elder was invested with similar properties, which seem to have been more potent than even those attributed to the St. John's wort. According to an old tradition, any baptized person whose eyes were anointed with the green juice of its inner bark could see witches in any part of the world. Hence the tree was extremely obnoxious to witches, a fact which probably accounts for its having been so often planted near cottages. Its magic influence has also caused it to be introduced into various rites. As a safeguard, persons are recommended to make a magic circle, in the center of which they should stand with elderberries gathered on St. John's night. By so doing, the magic fern seed may be obtained, which possesses the strength of 30 or 40 men. In Germany, too, a species of wild radish is said to reveal witches, as also is the ivy, which enables its bearers to see witches on Walpurgis night. But, in spite of plants of this kind, witches somehow or other contrive to escape detection by the employment of the most subtle charms and spells. They generally, too, took the precaution of avoiding such plants as were antagonistic to them, displaying a cunning ingenuity in most of their designs, which it was by no means easy to forestall. Hence, in the composition of their potions, they infused the juices of most herbs, such as that of nightshade or monkshood, and to add to the potency of these baleful draughts, they considered it necessary to add as many as 7 or 9 of the most poisonous plants they could obtain, such, for instance, as was enumerated by one of the witches in Ben Jonson's Masque of Queens, who says, "And I have been plucking plants among hemlock, henbane, adder's tongue, nightshade, moonwort, libbard's bane, and twice by the dogs was like to be taken." Another plant used by witches in their incantations was the horned poppy, known in medieval times as Ficus infernalis. Hence, it is further noticed by Ben Jonson in the witch's song, "Yes, I have brought to help our vows, horned poppy, cypress boughs, the fig tree wild that grows on tombs, and juice that from the larch tree comes." Then, of course, there was the wondrous moonwort, which was doubly valuable from its mystic virtue, for it was believed to open locks and possess other magic virtues. The mullein, popularly termed the hag taper, was also in request. By Scotch witches, the woodbine was a favorite plant, who, in effecting magical cures, passed their patients 9 times through a girth or garland of green woodbine. We have already incidentally spoken of the vervain, St. John's wort, elder, and rue as antagonistic to witchcraft, but to these may be added many other well-known plants, such as the juniper, mistletoe, and blackthorn. Indeed, the list might be greatly extended, the vegetable kingdom having supplied in most parts of the world almost countless charms to counteract, in our own country, the little pimpernel and cyclamen were formerly gathered for this purpose. The snapdragon had the reputation of averting the most subtle forms of witchcraft, and dill and flax were worn as talismans against sorcery. Holly is said to be antagonistic to witches, and in its name they see but another form of the word holy. Then there is the mountain ash, which has long been considered one of the most powerful antidotes against works of darkness of every kind, probably from its sacred associations with the worship of the Druids. Hence, it is much valued in Scotland, and the following couplet, of which there are several versions, still embodies the popular faith. Mountain ash and red thread put the witches to their speed. But its fame has not been confined to any one locality, and as far south as Cornwall, the peasant, when he suspects that his cow has been overlooked, twists an ash twig round its horns. Indeed, so potent is the ash as a countercharm to sorcery that even the smallest twig renders their actions impotent. And hence, in an old ballad entitled Laidley Wood in the Northumberland Garland, it is said, "The spells were vain, the hag returned to the queen in sorrowful mood, crying that witches have no power where there is ash tree wood." Occasionally, when the dairymaid churned for a long time without making butter, she would stir the cream with a twig of mountain ash and beat the cow with another, thus breaking the witch's spell. But to prevent accidents of this kind, it has long been customary in the northern countries to make the churn staff of ash. For the same reason, herd boys employ an ash twig for driving cattle, and one may often see a mountain ash growing near a house. On the continent, the tree is in equal repute, and in Norway and Denmark, ash branches are usually put over stable doors to keep out witches, a similar notion prevailing in Germany. No tree, perhaps, holds such a prominent place in witchcraft lore as the mountain ash, its mystic power having rarely failed to render fruitless the evil influence of these enemies of mankind, and let the good prevail.